The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. This is Sue Prentiss. I'm the advocate for REPLICA, and welcome to our webinar today on interstate compacts and EMS. We're going to talk about the history, the progress, and the future. I'd like to go over just a few of the ground rules or directions for today's webinar. All attendees are on mute to start. You will be able to, obviously, you'll be listening along. If you have questions, you should be able to see a control bar to your right where you can either raise your hand or you can click and you can write a question. All questions and hand raising will be recognized and answered in order at the end of the webinar in our section for questions and answers. This is also recorded and will be available on the REPLICA website at the conclusion of our webinar today. So without further ado, we're going to get started. And first I would like to introduce our panelists. So Rick Masters is here with he's special counsel for the National Center for Interstate Compacts. Again, my name is Sue Prentiss and I'm the advocate for REPLICA. Joe Schmider is the chair of the Interstate Commission for EMS Personnel Practice. And Drew Dawson is the interim director for the National Registry of EMTs. So we're going to start off this morning or this afternoon. Some of you, it might be this morning, with Rick Masters from the National Center for Interstate Compacts.
Or not.
Did I lose you, Rick?
Hello, it's good to be with all of you today, and the first lesson we have to learn is to press mic when it's time to talk. In addition to my work with the National Center for Interstate Compacts, I'm currently serving as the interim counsel for the commission that was established by REPLICA and meet either electronically or in person when those meetings are called of both the executive committee and the commission, as well as other activities in which the commission is involved in, which my expertise might be helpful. I have been involved with the law of interstate compacts since I first came to work with the Council of State Governments over 25 years ago after serving as an assistant attorney general in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. At that time, if you had asked me what an interstate compact was, I probably would have guessed a Japanese import that you drive from state to state, but that's not what they are. They are constitutionally authorized statutory contracts where the states are authorized by the federal constitution to enter into agreements that are also part of the statutory codes of each member state. The beauty of this process is that states, by entering into these contractual statutory compacts, have the ability to regulate in a uniform way. There are many who think that the only way that can be achieved is through federal legislation and preemption of the states. But our founding fathers, thank God, were prescient enough to realize in Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3 of the federal Constitution that there might be times when the states need to exercise their sovereignty under our system to regulate certain areas that are understood to be within the purview of the states and preserved there by the limited government that is supposed to be formed through our Constitution. As a result, in the 240 plus years that we've been a nation, interstate compacts have been used in a wide variety of ways, beginning in the earliest phase. In fact, before the Constitution was ratified among the original 13 colonies, compacts were used to resolve boundary disputes between the original 13 colonies and later the states. What has changed over the past 240 years is the use of these instruments for now a wide variety of administrative and regulatory structures in all aspects of endeavor that involve state government, such as natural resource management, transportation issues, education, corrections, public safety, and that certainly includes both emergency management and occupational licensure, such as that for EMS personnel that is authorized under REPLICA. anytime that you have an interstate transaction that is regulated by the states, that activity, if it recurs on a regular basis, is a likely subject for an interstate compact. Why? Because this allows the states to collectively manage what they already have the authority to do on an individual basis. And so these occupational licensure compacts, for example, and any other compact that states may enter into, and by the way, states on average have enacted about 24 compacts in a wide variety of subject matters, so that these are not instruments that one could call unusual in terms of state government. Every state has enacted at least a couple dozen of them, including, we hope, in the future, all 50 states will be adopting the REPLICA compact for occupational licensure portability for EMS personnel. But as you can see on the screen, we have the citation from the Constitution authorizing these instruments between states. Now, I'll call your attention to a grammatical issue that one might encounter upon the first reading of this clause, because when you read the words, "no state shall without the consent of Congress enter into any agreement or compact with another state," it sounds like every compact must require the consent of Congress. But as it has done on a number of occasions, the U.S. Supreme Court has redefined the English language in the compact clause, and any agreement under this clause does not mean all agreements, only some agreements. Not all agreements must be consented to by Congress, and the way you tell whether a compact requires the consent of Congress is whether or not some enumerated power that is given to the federal government by the federal Constitution is implicated. If not, then the compact does not require congressional consent. So, for example, in the area of occupational licensure, an area which states have traditionally regulated throughout, whether it's EMS personnel or doctors or nurses or physical therapists or whatever, states have always regulated occupational licensure for the most part within the boundaries of those states. And so all we're doing with the compact is extending the reach of that regulation that's already resting within the purview of the states across state lines. And for the states to do what they already have the power to do on a collective basis does not require the Congress of the United States to consent. So that's what that doctrine is all about, and that's what that case on the screen and a lot of others stands for within this particular legal mechanism. And we're ready for the next slide. Just to get a little more technical for those of you who may have some law training, or even if you don't, it's important to understand that compacts, although they are statutes, they're also contracts. And so the first state to enact a compact is making an offer to the other states to join an agreement by accepting that offer through enacting legislation that is substantially similar to the first state's enactment in which the offer was made. Now, what this means is that because compacts are contracts, you can't substantially change the language of the compact. Why? Because like any other contract between commercial entities or private parties, if you don't sign a contract that contains substantially the same language as the other person or entities that have signed that contract, then you don't have an agreement. So unlike other types of legislation, compacts can't be widely amended if to do so would substantially change the operational aspects of the compact. So that's the reason why compacts have to be carefully enacted with no substantial deviations from the standard language so that the contract will not be defeated. The value of these instruments, once again, is once they are enacted, the compact serves as a contractual obligation of all of the other states. And once the state has entered a compact, it takes precedence over conflicting statutes that may be enacted subsequently by a state. While a state can't unilaterally nullify or revoke or amend one of its compacts if the state compact does not so provide, it can repeal a compact if it decides it wants out. So while you're obligated to follow the rules and comply with the compact, if your state decides later on for some reason, whatever reason, or no reason at all, that it no longer wants to participate, you get out of a compact the same way you got in it by enacting legislation. I think we have probably said enough about this, but I'll just make the statement one more time so that states that will be enacting this compact, hopefully that have tuned in today and you have not done so, once you do enact it under the Constitution, both the compact clause and the contract clause provide that no state can unilaterally enact a conflicting state law once you have entered into a compact. And that's what gives them their durability, because once you have enacted an agreement and you've agreed as part of that compact obligation that you'll handle business such as occupational licensure in a certain way, you can't then unilaterally change the way you do that unless all the other states agree. One of the other features of compacts that makes them useful and flexible is the idea that they can engage in rulemaking. Now, that doesn't mean that compacts are going to become rogue agencies that are going to change the practice acts of all the states. It only applies to the interstate aspects of the regulation. And really, when you think about it, without a compact, you can't regulate the next state's requirements, even if you wanted to. You're only able to regulate within your state boundaries unless you have adopted the compact that extends the reach of the state regulation of EMS personnel, in this case, across a state line. And as part of that regulatory structure, legislatures have been engaged in creating these compact entities and delegating rulemaking authority to them for many years. And the screen that you're seeing right now contains a reference to a Supreme Court decision back in 1951 that's still viable today and has been subsequently restated in other more recent decisions, that a state may delegate regulatory authority to a compact agency created by an interstate compact agreement, and that there is no constitutional impediment or prohibition against doing so. Compact rulemaking has been said by Justice Frankfurter, for example, to be an axiom of modern government. We form administrative agencies because they have certain expertise in the area that the legislature has charged them to regulate, and commissions created by a compact are such agencies and have the power to do this. This also takes care of the problem where you may need to make some changes within the compact regulatory structure to reflect new ways of doing business, new regulatory requirements, and other reasons why you might need to have a means of reacting to innovations that weren't thought of at the time the compact was enacted. So while you can't change the statutory language, you are able to amend your rules as long as they're within the scope of the authority of the statute to reflect new changes that occur in the way regulation of various activities that compacts are empowered to regulate do business. And you see some later cases here that adopt this same authority with regard to compact rulemaking. The only point we're trying to make is that the ability of a compact agency such as REPLICA to make rules is well established, and there's no constitutional doubt that that is the case. We have formed an interstate commission through the REPLICA statute, like many other interstate compact regulatory structures, and it is a joint agency of the states that make it up, and it is defined as such within the compact. It's not a nonprofit organization. It's not a corporation. It is an unincorporated legal entity that has been formed by state statute that is empowered to administer the functions that are set out in the REPLICA compact, including administrative rulemaking. It also has the authority under the compact to provide oversight, education and training for member state agency personnel, to resolve disputes between states, and to provide for enforcement if a state is not complying with its obligations under the compact. Other examples of licensure compacts, particularly within the healthcare arena, since that's what we're doing in the EMS world, are the Enhanced Nurse Licensure Compact, which currently has 30 member states, the Interstate Medical Licensure Compact, which obviously is for physicians, which is now enacted in 25 states, soon to be 26. The Physical Therapy Licensure Compact, which I believe is at 18 and then the psychology interjurisdictional compact, that it has been enacted in 5 states and might soon trigger its administrative agency being able to take root and begin business with the adoption of 7 states of that compact. So we've got a slide here that needs to be updated, but that's the status of the psychology compact.
Okay.
Here is a, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
Sue.
I'd be happy to take over. And I had noticed on SIPAC's website that they are 1 state away from their 7 right now, being able to.
Okay, I was going to say there was a 6th one that slipped in there. I think it might have been Nebraska. So yeah, that's right. So we got one more change to make in our slide so that we are real close to a active commission for psychology. But it certainly makes the point that these instruments are being enacted regularly by the states, and we're seeing a great deal of progress in all of the healthcare licensure compacts, and we will soon see other occupational licensure compacts, which I can talk more about perhaps at the end if we have time. But I'm going to give the baton to Sue, and I'll chime in if I think there's anything I can add. Go ahead, Sue.
Please do. And this is a great segue, talking about SIPAC, because Nebraska is one of our most recent replica states to come online, and actually SIPAC and replica were passed together and at the same on the same bill in 2 different sections. So a great partnership in moving compacts. As you can see, we have 14 replica states, with Nebraska and South Carolina being our 2 most recent, and we have 2 states that are waiting for governor's signatures, Missouri and the state of New Hampshire. So the replica compact is moving across with some connectivity across the country, and it's an exciting time, not just for replica, but as you can see, the history of the other compacts that Rick just briefly went over. And something I'm sure he can touch on at the end is that those memberships, with the exception of the nurses that have moved from an older compact to a newer one, didn't just happen in 1 or 2 years. It took multiple years to grow to the size that they are. So we're right on track. So let's talk about why we have replica. And as I said earlier, we have panelist Joe Schmider from the state of Texas, who's the chairman of the commission, on the phone with us. And we have Rick from the Interstate Compact Center. We have Drew Dawson from the National Registry, but we also have Dia Gaynor on the line with us, and she's the executive director for the National Association of State EMS Officials. And when Dia and I, she worked on the National Advisory Panel and the drafting team, but Dia and I go back to the days of being state EMS directors. And these were some of the issues that kept us up at night, and they were singular issues that came together, as Rick talked about, collectively, when 2 or more states are trying to solve a problem or problems. An interstate compact is a tool, a recognized, flexible, time-tested tool to get the job done. We have federal personnel that are in details in states, multiple states, every day, on the ground, providing medical care for the groups that they're there to protect. We know that we have mass casualty incidents that are happening across state lines, where the closest personnel are right across the state line or multiple state lines, but it's not at a governor's declaration of disaster. It's not an EMAC request, or it doesn't activate the national ambulance contract. And so we need to be able to move personnel in those situations and have them legally, formally recognized in order to do that. We have agencies, EMS agencies, who have a multi-state footprint. They have had it, they'll continue to have it, but it is a burden on their personnel to have to carry more than 1 license to do their jobs. And we have connected with folks throughout the course of replica that are carrying 2 and 3 licenses in order to be able legally, properly recognized to do their jobs in the same job in multiple states. Again, mutual aid to and from adjacent states. You've got to remember that replica is a national policy, that what might happen in one part of the country in terms of mutual aid is going to be different from what happens in another part of the country. So when you set up a policy and a compact like this, you are addressing, in a broad brushstroke across the nation, what all the potential scenarios might be. And last but not least, when we're talking about things that keep state EMS directors up at night, is that we have folks who move, licensed personnel who move from one state to the next, and they are just ahead of their last infraction or disciplinary action in one state or in multiple states, are not self-declaring, and are becoming licensed in states and operating with a licensure history that becomes a public protection issue. These are all things collectively that REPLICA can and does plan to address as it moves forward. We have to remember that REPLICA is an immediate legal recognition for licensed EMS personnel to do their job across state lines on an intermittent basis. We are increasing access to care for patients who are on one side of that line or another to need the closest personnel. We are reducing the regulatory burdens to carry multiple licenses in states, and we are increasing accountability and public protection in our profession. So in talking, we just briefly went over what keeps the state EMS officials up at night. It flows really nicely into why we are where we're at today. Dee and I and many, and even Drew, go back to the conversations about how to move wildland firefighters across our country. That's not just in the West and the Midwest. They are moving all across our country, and they need to be able to be stood up and recognized in order to provide medical care to the teams that they serve. We see, again, the federal personnel that are moving across our country on a daily basis and need that immediate legal recognition. And then we've also talked about the mobility of our qualified personnel in terms of having a multi-state footprint, already doing this job, and having those additional burdens placed on them. By having REPLICA, we increase our public protection by having a mechanism by which to set that bar for fitness, the standards by which our EMS personnel, when they're initially licensed, are recognized. We have a way through a national coordinated EMS database that will be set up to share information, and we will then be able to support the mobility of our qualified personnel on that intermittent mission-specific basis. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we move through the presentation. Why do we have REPLICA? Because we want people to be able to do their job across state lines when they're needed to do it on a time-specific, mission-specific, time-limited, and intermittent basis. We're most interested, all of us here, in making sure that the public is properly protected, making sure that there is a bar for fitness, and that is not the physical fitness, but we're talking about how folks are screened for making sure that they meet those baseline competencies of their certification and their licensure in order to practice. That we have a way of protecting the public by being able to share licensure information about the personnel that are crossing state lines. It's important to remember, and Rick talked about compacts in general, and we've talked a little bit about some of the licensing compacts that are out there, but I just want to point to one of the compacts that's not a healthcare licensing compact, but is a licensing compact, which is the driver's license compact. I live in New Hampshire, and I live right on the border of Vermont, and I drive into Vermont almost every single day. But the state of Vermont doesn't ask me for a driver's license to operate on their road. They know that I have a New Hampshire license, they recognize that so that I can drive on their roads for the period of time that I am in their state. They also know that they have access to my background through a national real-time online database, so that if I get a speeding ticket or that if I'm in a car accident, that there is a way for them to check my background, there is a way for them to report this, and there is a way between myself as the person holding that driver's license and the state of Vermont and the state of New Hampshire to resolve the issue. REPLICA is most like the driver's license compact without the medicine part of it, if you think about that type of movement and sharing of information and intermittent nature. What REPLICA does, again, it increases access to EMS personnel for our patients. This is, again, a personnel licensure compact that has nothing to do with the agencies. Ambulance services, whether they're by ground or by air, are supposed to be licensed. and they're expected to be licensed by the compact in order for them to do that part of their job. This relaxes the licensing requirements at that initial level for just the personnel in those vehicles. So by being able to cross a state line, being the closest personnel to care for a patient, to pick somebody up and transport them, those are ways that we increase access to EMS personnel for our patients. We also know that not all EMS personnel and not all incidents require vehicles. They require personnel. Those might be those mass casualty events. That might be the pre-staging for an event that's anticipated. That might be a public health emergency where personnel are needed. This is not about vehicles. This is not about ambulance services. Access is at that point where we're talking about people. Decreasing the burden on our EMS personnel who do presently have to carry more than one license to do their job. In my previous service in a northern New Hampshire ambulance service, I had to carry a license in New Hampshire and in Vermont because the service that I worked for had a multi-state footprint. And we did that. And we had 2 different sets of protocols, and 2 different licenses to get our job done. This is a place where REPLICA would address that situation. And it does bring about an unprecedented level of accountability for cross-border EMS personnel practice by a number of different ways. One is, again, the National Coordinated EMS Database, a way for us to share licensure history in real time for the personnel who are part of member states. REPLICA requires, we talk about individual eligibility that folks have EMS medical direction. So they have EMS medical direction, and we have a way to access their background in real time and manage these situations where we have not previously had this throughout the country. How REPLICA does this, using the tool that Rick talked about, which is the Interstate Compact, we are extending a privilege to practice in member states under authorized circumstances. REPLICA is not a multi-state license. It's not a national certification. It is a way for the circumstances that are authorized to move personnel to do their job, the job that's assigned to them at that time, and then for them to go back to whatever base or home state that they are hailing from when they receive that assignment. REPLICA stands up, again, this National Coordinated EMS Database. It's a way to share personnel information in a real-time way as necessary. This is, again, the first time that states will be able to share this kind of information. And by putting the REPLICA law in place, it allows states to do that who previously couldn't. REPLICA also creates an expedited pathway for members of the military and their spouses that are separating from active duty to move to the front of the line for licensure in the states which they are applying. So this does not, REPLICA in terms of the veterans, it recognizes that when they're coming out, when they're separating from active duty, either them or their spouses, and they have an unrestricted national registry card, that they, again, would have an expedited pathway for licensure in member states. From there, if necessary, and doing their job, if it was a cross-border job, certainly they would have a privilege to practice like everybody else. But this, in recognition of their service, moves them to the front of the line. Authorized circumstances, you hear myself and other folks in this call will speak to this or mention these circumstances regularly. This is important to point out again. This is not a multi-state license. We have specific circumstances in Section 5 of the compact. So day-to-day cross-border movement of personnel in the line of their duty, large-scale mass casualty incidents that, again, have not reached a governor's declaration of disaster, have not requested, an EMAC request has not been placed, and it doesn't activate the National Ambulance Contract. And also large-scale planned incidents that have drained local resources and require additional personnel. Examples would be, during some of our public health emergencies, we know that there are, say, clinics that are set up, immunization clinics, where folks, paramedics, are being, trained and allowed to immunize people who are coming for whatever particular public health crisis is, requiring or requesting that folks come and get immunized. If those resources were to be drained, this would be a place where EMS personnel under REPLICA could step in if assigned by an appropriate authority. This could also cover large sporting events, some of the, the Tough Mudders, as well as concerts. We hear from our folks in Tennessee that the Bonnaroo concert, which is a multi-day incident, they've had to, not incident, but event, they've had to license personnel to do that, where if they're coming from a member state and they needed their help, they could bring them in and they'd have their clearance under the compact. Discipline and adverse actions, it's just important to point out that, as I just want to hark back to the driver's license compact example, that when we think about this, the home state where that person, that EMS personnel comes from, where they're licensed, that is their home state. That home state is who controls that license, and if a home state takes any type of action against that license, is something that they share immediately with all of the other states. The basic nature of it, what has happened, whether it's what restrictions been put in place. Is it a revocation? Is it a suspension? Is it some type of immediate restriction or letter of warning? So these are some of the things that are and will be considered by the commission. But the primary point here is that the home states, like I live in the state of New Hampshire, they control my license. And if there's an action taken against it, it will be shared, a restriction, with the member states. Remote states, the places that I or other EMS personnel would be traveling into to do their job under an authorized circumstance, they can restrict, they can revoke or suspend a privilege to practice, and that would also be shared with member states, but they cannot revoke or suspend or remove, take away somebody's license. Our ultimate decisions about licensure remain with the home member state. And again, as we go through this is a broad overview. I'm happy to answer any questions either at the end or offline. I'm giving you just some of the broad pieces of REPLICA. I've mentioned multiple times, and it's something I'm really proud of and excited that we're bringing this national EMS database online. There's something that in the partnership discussion at the end of the call with Drew Dawson from the National Registry, this is a place where REPLICA has partnered to set up the first of its kind, a way for states who are member states to share information, personal licensure history information, share significant investigatory information, and any type of either discipline history or something that happens that can be shared immediately in real time with other states. This is something, again, that we have not been able to do in a formal legal way between the different states. And it is certainly a public protection, a plus for public protection, but with our inability to do this in a comprehensive legal way, it is not a plus for public protection. Rick Masters Rick, I'll prompt you at the end to speak to the nurses database. We are building the REPLICA coordinated database in the footprint of what the nurses have already done. And actually their database is called nurses. It's just not spelled the same way that we spell nurses on a routine basis. But there's been experience in this area that's really valuable to us. No need to reinvent the wheel, but to learn from those that have done it well in service to the healthcare profession. REPLICA state eligibility. So when you're queuing up and you're considering filing a bill and becoming a REPLICA state, you need to be using, or by the time you pass the law, have in place a system to use the National Registry exam at the EMT and paramedic levels for initial licensure only. So this is, again, initial licensure. Member states, they share this as their fitness test. How states recertify their folks, refresh their folks, those develop their protocols, inspect their ambulances, all of that is over and above. This is at the time, this is the entry, criteria for entry. So states, if they're not already doing this, they agree to this in order to be eligible. Using an FBI compliant background check with biometric data within 5 years of the compact's activation. The clock has started ticking on this, so we're looking at May 8th, 2022 for this to be the full-time for this, the 5-year window to be closed on this. So states that are joining now that don't have this in place, I'll give you an example. Alabama's in the process of putting their FBI compliant background check in place. Having a process to receive, investigate, and resolve complaints, as well as share information with compact states as necessary through the coordinated database. So if you're in a state who could not share that information previously, joining the compact gives you the ability to share that information in that protected setting. And obviously, and importantly, we need to get a bill filed and ultimately enact the replica model legislation. Individual eligibility, license, so this would be the individual personnel themselves within our member states. They have to be licensed in a home state. It's practicing in good standing at EMT through paramedic level. They need to have the supervision of a medical director. This again is about accountability, and they need to be at least 18 years of age. Just quickly, what REPLICA does not do, some points I have mentioned throughout this conversation today. It's not a multi-state license. It's a privilege to practice in authorized circumstances. It does not create automatic reciprocity. So reciprocity, if you're looking for a license-to-license exchange, to take that and to go to work in another state, that process is separate from a privilege to practice in authorized circumstances. REPLICA does not have authority over EMS and ambulance licensure and subsequently the vehicles. So the very last line of the compact under Section 15, construction and severability, says that nothing in this compact supersedes this basically state statute and rules for ambulance licensure. We expect that ambulance services by air and by ground will be stood up and doing what they're supposed to do in terms of licensure with the states where they routinely operate. REPLICA does not supersede the Emergency Management Assistance Compact or the National Ambulance Contract. REPLICA does not reach into other EMS operations in unrelated jurisdictions. It does not write protocols. It does not deal with inspections of ambulances. It does. This is just about initial licensure only. So, without further ado, since I've just moved us from Rick, walked us through compacts, then we talked about our EMS specific compact, and now I'm actually going to turn to the very first chairman of the very first Interstate Commission for EMS Personnel Practice, Joe Schmider, from the great state of Texas. Some of you might know him from when he was a state EMS director in Pennsylvania, and asked Joe to talk a little bit about the commission.
Well, thank you, Sue. That was really helpful information. And Rick, you guys make it sound so simple until you start sitting down, writing the rules and trying to figure out how do we make this operational. But let me just first say it is my honor and privilege to serve as the first chairman of the compact and of the commission. This has been an interesting ride since the very beginning. And I think even higher arching is that we're now setting a national standard for EMS. We're saying, here's the background check we've gone through. Here is the education we're all doing. We'll be able to share information back and forth, and I think that is all good. When I started in this business in 1974, it was a while ago, none of those things were in place. And in today's world, as I got married and started raising a family in Pennsylvania, I would never have dreamed that I was going to be living in Texas. And here we are, 57 years later, I'm living in the state of Texas. So I think this compact will help that. The commission has been meeting for a while now, and we're trying to get established. We've set some basic ground rules on how we're operating things in bylaws. And we meet every other week, and then we have commissioners, all the states, as we start developing the rules and understanding exactly what we're doing. Each state has one representative that is appointed by somebody of authority who has the authority to make this appointment in their state, and we communicate with each other. They are very public meetings. We do not meet outside of formal agendas. It is similar, and I put it in place. I sat on the Planning Commission for 11 years in my community back in Pennsylvania, and it's the same kind of scenario. There has to be an agenda. You can't have a majority of members, all those kind of things. So it's very public and very open meetings when we do meet. And we've been having ongoing meetings with the National Registry as we develop the coordinated database. So if you think about this, even though I know we're not a business and we're not a nonprofit, we are setting up a structure of government, and we're starting from ground zero. And that has probably been one of the hardest things to understand and learn and get done. As you know, we've elected our officers at our first meeting. We adopted bylaws. We have a rule on a process on rulemaking. At our last meeting up in Rhode Island, we developed a policy on how we're going to develop these rules so that it's an open process, that everyone has input into it. Because one of the biggest criticisms we had in the beginning was that we could just do these things in secret. And if you look at the statute that makes the compact and makes the replica, you would know that's just not true. This is a open process. So I keep saying to people, we're hopefully to have things operational in about a year. It just takes that long to get everything done, but it's been going well. The commissioners that sit on the commission are all dedicated to do what's right for the EMS community. And Sue, I wrote myself a little bit of note to remind you, I think it would be beneficial for this group to just say why we say EMT, the paramedic, and we don't talk about advanced EMT or EMT intermediate. I think taking 30 seconds here may not be a bad idea to explain that if you want to do that.
And actually, I'm going to tag Dia to chime in with me, because Dia was on the work not just with the National Advisory Panel, but with the drafting team. So Dia, if I may just point over to you to address this question.
Sure, I'd be happy to. This is Dia Gaynor. I'm the Executive Director of the National Association of State EMS Officials. We recognized during the drafting process that despite the consolidation of nomenclature that was achieved through the National EMS Education Agenda for the Future, as well as the resultant scope of practice model, that the terminology used by states for levels of licensure in between EMT and paramedic continues to vary. So we utilized language that points to EMT specifically, paramedic specifically, and then any level that is licensed and recognized by the home state. So regardless of its name, anything in between an EMT and a paramedic that the home state licenses is also covered by the compact.
Thank you, Dia.
Thank you, Dia. Let me just say, Sue, before we pass it on to Drew, I really do want to recognize Dia for her vision on developing this concept and this compact as we move forward. I know that I've been involved probably about 4 years, and I'm sure Dia had thoughts about this a lot longer than that. But Dia, your vision was inspiring, and it's something that you and I and Sue and all of us will leave behind when we go on into our next career, whatever that is, to spending all the money we made in this career, I think. But anyway, I just want to publicly say thank you, and to all the writers. And I think we turn it now over to Drew.
Yes, we do.
Well, thank you very much. This is Drew Dawson. I'm the Interim Executive Director for the National Registry of EMTs. I would view our relationship with the Commission as very much of a close partnership, very much of a close partnership from the beginning. So our role in terms of partnering with Commission is sort of what we do on an everyday basis with state offices of emergency medical services. We have a partnership. We have a partnership regarding the certification of emergency medical technicians, and paramedics, but that partnership is really geared toward helping to assure quality, helping to assure that folks can move expeditiously from one state to the other, and we just have a solid partnership. So we are just continuing that partnership with the commission. So it's likely that we will be providing administrative support services to the commission to help them with their operation, and that because we're already have a fairly extensive database of emergency medical services personnel and sort of the mechanics set up to do that, that we'll be working on the coordinated database in conjunction with the commission. It'll be a little bit different animal as we work with the commission and some of the special requirements of REPLICA, but in principle, it'll be very similar to some of the types of things that we are doing now. So we're looking forward to continued strong partnership with the commission in support of emergency medical services. So with that, back to you folks.
Great. Thanks so much, Drew. So the future, what's next? And this is open for any of our panelists to join in. The first piece I wanted to touch, and Chairman Schmider had briefly mentioned, how long or the process it's going to take us to get the compact to its operational format. There is on the front page of our website, if you look to the right of this slide, you can see a status statement that has been prepared by the commission. This was initially published in August, and it was updated in April to reflect, that we are a compact, that we are in the process of taking the necessary steps to make the compact operational, and what our projected dates of full operation are going to be, as well as the FBI compliant background check. So I get calls pretty regularly, and I know some of the state offices of our member states do. Folks want to know that, what's happening. And so this is a place to just get a brief overview of that, and certainly always happy to answer any questions that you have. There is a section of our website under compact governance that talks about commission meetings and rulemaking activities, and that's a place where you can go and see the latest on what the executive committee and the commission has been talking about. There's also a commission resources button down the bottom where you can see briefing books, as well as you can look at like the webinar from today will be posted there, and we have the audio copies of the previous meetings that the commission has held, either virtually or in person. There is, rulemaking, as Joe has mentioned, as well as Rick talked about general rulemaking, but Joe talked about rulemaking specific to the compact that the commission it's under their authority to do that. So when Rick Masters talked about that, the contract between states, and that things being done the same way at that time, and here we're talking about the time of one of the key pieces has to do with initial licensure, as well as when we talk about appropriate authority, as well as when people are assigned to do things that are part of their job that would be covered by this. Those are pieces that the commission needs to perform rulemaking on. So those are some of the things I'd like to offer up that are in our very immediate future. So the compact status statement is a great place to go, be looking at what's happening with the commission. Know that that we'll actually put next session, but the next meeting that the commission will be preparing for and talking about when their next meeting is going to be. But there are authorized functions that are underway and being talked about as recently as in Rhode Island last week. So Joe, Dia, Rick, and Drew, anything about the future for the compact that you want to point to or discuss?
So this is Joe. I just wanted to really emphasize what you said about going to our website to find out what's going on. That is the way we're communicating. We try to get out through stakeholder groups also, but the website is current and up to date. There's some Q&A there. There's updates on upcoming meetings, and speak to other commissioners. The list of the commissioners are there also. So please stay informed as we continue to develop this model and this compact and put it in place. And whenever else anything fails, pick up the phone and call me or contact me. So we are in this together, that's for sure.
Great. And we have a Replica News email address. So if you're on this call today, we talked about the website. We have a Facebook page. On the website, I also have a blog. But if you'd like to sign up and send, if I don't already have your email address, or if you'd like to send it to me, I will put you on our Replica News email list. And that's just the latest activities. If there's been an update to the website, if there's something that's related to a meeting or the meeting notices that we're sharing publicly, as we do, because this is a governmental body and a public process, that's the way to find out about things. So I put up all of our contact information, and if anybody has any questions, certainly we'd be happy to answer them. And I wanted to just touch back to Rick Masters to talk about just a little bit about the nurses database, if you can. I know the database isn't completely your thing, but you know some things about this working with the nurses. Anything you can add about how well that's worked?
Yeah, so I think the most significant fact about the nurse licensure compact data system is that it's been in operation for over 15 years. The nurse licensure compact, the earlier version of it, was actually begun over 15 years ago, and over the course of the following 15 years, 25 states had joined. There were a number of innovations that were needed, including criminal background checks that states had not agreed on in that original agreement. And as I told you in my original presentation at the first of this webinar, you can change a compact, but every state has to agree. So that and some other issues relating to rulemaking, enforcement, and other things were the subject of a comprehensive amendment, which was known as the Enhanced Nurse Licensure Compact. And so the old compact has been replaced, but the new one, because of the new agreement and the innovations and so on, it's actually at 30 now, and I think we'll see it grow to 50 states very, very soon. But the data system has been tried and tested, and it works well for both tracking, licensure, and discipline. And I think the fact that this is being used as the essential concept for the licensure information system that REPLICA is developing is a smart play, because it's the data system that's been in existence the longest for purposes of state regulation of licensure through the nursing boards, and I have no doubt that it will be equally efficient and effective once it's online and we have the rules in place with REPLICA. And we hope that we have all 50 states at the table eventually. I mean, I think that's the goal. We're not there yet. It could be that not every state will adopt it, but certainly that is the long-term goal, and there's no date by which that is required to happen, but it seems that it is sensible and logical that states would eventually want to join, and the more states that we have at the table, the more likely that we'll have others that will join us.
Well,
back to you, Sue.
Thanks, Rick. I mean, we are at 14 states where the governor has signed. Has signed the bill. We'll have 16 probably within the next 2 weeks. So we're, as we've wrapped up our legislative work for this year. The only bill that's still out there is a bill in study in Arkansas. And so we could, as we continue to engage in conversations with other states, REPLICA could be well over 20 by the end of the next legislative session. I think that's part of the reason that many of you are on this call, is to learn more about REPLICA, and we can help you engage and collaborate in your states. So let's let's get ourselves over 20. Let's get to 25, and let's keep moving and growing this, as we've seen the success with other compacts. And I just wanted to again open it up to anybody who might have any questions. We're here and we have time, and happy to do our best to answer them. And if not, I'm certainly happy to take your calls and your emails offline as well. Okay, I don't see any hands being raised or or calls coming, texts coming into the question box. So I want to thank Rick Masters. I want to thank Joe Schmider. I want to thank Drew Dawson, and of course Diagano from the National Association of State EMS Officials. Again, Rick is with the National Center for Interstate Compacts. Drew is with the National Registry of EMTs, and Joe is the chairman of the commission, the Interstate Commission for EMS Personnel Practice, and the State EMS Director in Texas. So thank you all for joining us today. I hope those of you that participated have got what you came for, and we have certainly much more to talk about as we move forward into another exciting year of growing Replica. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue.